Hello. So as you can see from the title of this video, today I will be sharing my testimony. So my mom asked me a while ago if I would be sharing my testimony on my channel. And at first I thought, probably not, because my channel doesn't have as much of a faith focus. But as I thought more about my testimony, well, I guess I kind of already knew this, but I kind of thought that there's some things in my testimony that I've dealt with, and things that I've dealt with after becoming a Christian. So be warned, this testimony will not end after I become a Christian. There's some things that I've struggled with in my testimony that I feel aren't really talked about in Christian circles. Well, I guess the general brand, but not specifically what I was dealing with. So my hope with this video is that someone out there would feel less alone, and that one thing I really want to get across, if I've thumbnailed this video how I want to thumbnail it, I want to get across in this video, just because if you're a Christian, but you still struggle with some things, just know that you are not any less saved. Your salvation is not dependent on what you do. That's what I really want to get across as well. So I've shared my testimony a few times at this point, and there's been oftentimes when I share, there's been some things that I didn't share. I think the part where I shared the most was when it was to an audience of just girls, and I bet at least a few of them were thinking, why did we just hear about this girl's past crushes? And there will still be some of that, but I'll try to only share what is necessary to my testimony. So yeah, I think that's all. Let's just get into it. So I will start my testimony as many of the testimonies that I've heard start, which is that I grew up in a Christian home. And I am eternally grateful for my parents for that they raised us with that. And I was told later that I got saved at this family camp that we went to when I was 4 years old. But I don't remember, I remember that camp, but I don't remember being saved at that camp, giving my life to Christ or anything. So I personally do not think that that's when I was saved. So yeah, there's that. For first few years of school years, I went to a public school. So yeah, I went to a public school for the first few years of school, and I liked it at the time, but looking back, it impacted me in ways that I didn't realize at the time. The one thing that I would say that was a hard thing, the one thing I would say about me, during this time, was that I had a lot of pride, and I didn't even really realize it, at the time. Some kids would, compliment me, and it would, go to my head, and I was thinking I was all that and superior, and I don't know if people were as bothered by it, but it was a thing. And another thing that was hard at the time that I wasn't quite prepared for was, I think, going to public school, as what I thought was Christian. I should have mentioned this earlier. I don't remember being saved at the camp, but because I was growing up because I was told that, I grew up thinking that I was saved. So going to public school as a Christian, I think I was thinking there'd be more overt attacks on Christianity, with, oh, God doesn't exist, and I thought they would teach about evolution, and also yoga was also a thing, which I did get into an argument with my gym teacher about yoga, but I was the one who brought it up, which not the smartest move, but I think I was 7 or something, so yeah. But the one thing that I wasn't quite prepared for was things that sound good but aren't actually true. And I don't want to blame my parents for not preparing me for that, but yeah, that was the thing. Although it's hard to remember exactly what it was that sounded good that I didn't quite know. It's I know they were thinking about, they were big on anti-bullying and being kind, and of course those things are all good. I think the main thing that I would think of back then is maybe the self-esteem stuff was kind of maybe not the best. I think the one thing that sounded good that I was that I was like knew like wait, that's not quite right, is when people would say believe in yourself, because at like church and stuff like that I would hear people say like believe in God, believe in Jesus. So whenever someone would say, oh, believe in yourself, I would think, no, don't believe in yourself, believe in Jesus. So one thing that I realized later was like pretty impactful on my faith is, so like as a part of like the church they were going to at the time, their like curriculum and stuff, it was this video series called What's in the Bible. It was made by one of the guys who made VeggieTales, Phil Vischer, and I know unfortunately Phil Vischer has gone off the rails in recent years, but this series I think was really solid about like teaching kids like the word and like all of that. And one thing that was interesting about this is that I guess what's sometimes missing from like the gospel presentation is like what Jesus is saving from and what our need for a savior is. And I do remember in the series they said pretty early on in the series that what we need to be saved from is sin, and like the power that yeah, we need to be saved from sin. That's one thing that may not always be included. And I remember like later on, although we watched it on YouTube and not on the DVD version, they were they were talking about like the story of Jesus, and they're talking about like all the led up to like his crucifixion and like passion and all that. And I remember like learning that and remember it really moving me. But and at the end they say like, hey, if you've never asked your parents if you want to become a Christian, like you should do that. But I thought I was already saved, so I didn't think. But that did stick with me and all that. So like, so when I was in grade 5 and it was later in the year, my parents sat me and my sister down and they were talking about sending us to a Christian school next year. And at first, me and my sister were both kind of resistant to it, but after hearing more about it, like the more I heard about this school that they were thinking of sending us to, the more I really wanted to go. So it was a strange occasion where I spent all summer being excited to go to this new school. But when I got there, it was harder than I thought, like with all like the homework and stuff, because I think looking back there was a lot of homework for like grade 6 in that time. So yeah, like that was harder than I thought. And also at this time, like I was a hot mess with like all like the behaviors I was in and like all these things. Yeah, I was not doing well. But one good thing like about this time in my life is that now actually going to a Christian school and like learning more about like the Bible and all these things, I started to like understand the gospel more, like learning about like all these different elements of the gospel and like all these things. And I don't know what it was, but I remember praying many times that year, come into my heart if you haven't already. So yeah, like wanting to like really commit to this. And I remember like for one assignment that we were working on in class, it was like about like what do you believe like about like this stuff. And I remember they were playing the song like I believe in Jesus, I believe he died and rose again. I don't remember all the lyrics to that, but I remember listening to them and being like, yeah, yes I do believe that, and like all these things. So like around this time, and if I had to guess, I would think that around this time was when I was truly saved. I'm not exactly sure when it was, but I believe it was. I mean, surely one of those times where I said, "Come into my heart," if I haven't already, he did. So yeah, that's what I would say is when I was saved. So now going into middle school and like all these things, and I know a lot of people think of their middle school days as a tough time, and surely for me, and I think for me there were certainly some tougher times in middle school, but one thing I remember about this time was that I think especially grade 7, there was this passion I had for God and like really loving him and like wanting to obey him and all this. I remember one time in class they were talking about like what our sin, like what sinning like says to God and all of that. And I remember thinking afterwards, oh, I don't want to sin. So yeah, that was the one thing where so my heart was for God at this time. And looking back on it, I thought that like the problem, like what made things like not perfect in that sense, was the fact that my theology was a bit off, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly what ways. I guess it would tie into more of like what we're talk about in a bit. But then thinking about it again, there was another thing that seems to be more concerning of this time that made me want to question, like, oh, was I saved during this time? And there was this secret sin. So when I was 5 was the first time that I saw the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and like I don't remember much of what I thought of it at the time. But like of course, if you know that musical, you know there is the scene song with like the Potiphar's wife sequence. And of course at like 5 years old, like I didn't know what the heck was going on in that time. I remember thinking that when she would take off his shirt, I thought, oh, she's robbing him. So like there's that. But we saw this musical again when I was 12 because someone we knew was in it, and like of course like 12 you like you know more things, and of course like oh, this is what's happening in this case now. So already seeing that scene again, that was a little like, oh, that was like really something. But then what really set it off was that I guess shortly after that we somehow got a hold of, or we watched the 1999 direct-to-DVD movie adaptation of this musical with Donny Osmond, and that was something about that scene this time that like set everything off. Essentially have these sexualized fantasies that mainly play in my head, mainly at night, and like all these things. So yeah, that was a lot of what I was dealing with during. I was experiencing that during middle school. Now, what makes me want question like things is that looking back on the time and what I thought about these things, I knew that this was something that I couldn't tell anyone else. Like, it wasn't something I could openly talk about. But I don't remember thinking that it could be a sin. Like, I wasn't convicted about it from what I can remember. So that is maybe wonder like, oh, was I saved back then because I wasn't convicted about this thing? And of course, like thinking about it now, like with all the passion I had for God, I think I still was saved, and like I wasn't like the resources weren't all there. Like I didn't know enough to like think that this could be a sin, because like during this time, like yeah, they were starting to have like sex talk and all of that, like in class with like guys together and girls together, like all talking about these things. But I don't remember a lot about this time. Like I don't think they were really talking about sexual sin with us yet. And like this is of course like a very specific thing that's like hard to sum up shortly, that like I said, like isn't really talked about, like this version of it. Like I remember like what I knew about sexual sin at the time. I mean, I knew adultery was wrong, and I think I knew that sex before marriage was wrong. And I think I might have even heard about pornography, though I'm not sure. And I was going back and forth and wondering if I knew about the verse where like it says like if a man looks at a woman with lustful intent, he's already committed adultery with her in her heart. Like I'm not sure if I had heard that verse. If I did, I don't know if I would have made the connection to this. So yeah, I was still, I guess, young in the faith, and you don't get conviction of every single sin early on. Although what's interesting is I do remember like later on, like this whole thing, like these first like times that we saw Joseph, that was in like, I guess it would have been like November, maybe even December of 2016. And then I remember later on in the school year, but like the next year, so in like late spring 2017, we saw another production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, because again, someone else we knew was in it. And I remember seeing it again and like being like, oh, that scene is going to be there. And I remember like while that scene was playing, like during the time where there's like no music, where there's no like singing, no like there's no singing. I remember like closing my eyes or like covering my eyes during that scene. So that's interesting to think about because it seems to show that like I I think something like in me like knew like something was up. Like either I didn't want to be reminded of what I knew was what I didn't want to be reminded of what I knew I was thinking of at night when no one would see, or like if I could tell like maybe I shouldn't be seeing this and like all that. So there was that there, which was interesting. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. I still I don't remember much of it during in grade 8, so I'm still maybe not as much in grade 8, but still kind of dealing with it. But then another thing about this time during middle school is for grade 8, we went on this camp during this time, and I remember during that camp, like the few days we were there was like a real passion for God. I was like really learning about all this stuff. There was emphasis. I remember like the study when we were talking about the story of like Jacob wrestling with the angel and like all these things. And I remember like being outside my cabin, like singing a song that I knew to God. And I think the one thing there was like, and there we were to go all this one cabin that was set this for more like worship thing, and the one of our like the staff who was like more of like a spiritual like guy who like talked to like the middle school kids. He was like there and he gave this whole like I guess like sermon talk about like purpose and like all these things. And I remember that like really impacted me. I remember taking notes. I'm sure I still have the notes somewhere. And I remember like after that little talk, we sang the song Oceans by, is it Hillsong who sings that song? But you know Oceans. And I remember like singing that song and like I'd sang that song before, but I remember like this time like thinking about the words. Like I wasn't just singing it, I was like praying this. I was like, yes, God, take me and do whatever you want with me. Tell me to go wherever you want me to go. And even if I die, it'll be okay. And like all these things. Like I was like really sincere in wanting that. And then like in the few days, weeks, whatever, after, well, I guess like yeah, a few days like after I got back from the camp, that's when things started to get interesting. So what I realized like a few days after getting home from this camp was that I liked the boy in my musical theater class. Like this was a big deal for me because I remember like earlier, like right before the grade 8 school year, I was watching. I was a big fan of Jamie Grace at this time, and I remember one thing she talked about a lot was like dating and like dating with a purpose. I remember like kind of rationalizing in my head like, okay, you should date with a purpose. Of course, the purpose would be to get married, and I can't get married until I'm 18, which legally is not exactly true, but whatever. I can't get married till I'm 18, so therefore I cannot date until I was 18. So I vowed not to date until I was 18. So like realizing I liked this guy was like, oh, that's just gonna get in the way of that. So yeah, then I didn't tell people, but I was like wrestling with this in my mind. I was in this phase of turmoil. But what was a good thing about this time is that the sexualized fantasies that I was just talking about, they were like stopped during that time. Like I guess being so consumed with this, I like stopped engaging with that. So this was a blessing in that sense. So like I will say like this love, if you want to call it that, at the beginning was a very innocent love. So yeah, I was like in turmoil for a while. Then around the time of the show, I like accepted it, and then was in this like euphoria, being in love that I never felt before. And but then for whatever reason, also around this time, I guess was still like grappling with it. I remember one night, I don't quite know why, but I remember I cried out to God, like in my head, being like, why is this happening to me? And again, I don't remember exactly when this was, but in the time I was kind of like, is it really that bad? But I remember, like, as soon as I cried out, like, why is this happening to me? Like, overwhelmed in my mind, I remember this song. This is a song that it was written for the VeggieTales episode "It's a Meaningful Life," and it was playing during the credits, and it was written by Stephen Curtis Chapman. And remember the chorus goes, "You are meant to be touching the lives that you touch, meant to be here, making this worth so much more than it would be without you in it." And I remember, like, as that song like came to my memory, like all these things, I remember realizing I wouldn't want this any other way. So yeah, there was that, and I do believe that was God speaking, because I was crying out in my head, and I don't think the devil can read our minds. I was crying out in my head, and like overwhelmingly, that was like that. So like it went on, and then I think it was sometime, it was like late summer when I got this sense that I should give this crush up. Whatever it was, I didn't want to obey it. I like I'm still struggling with that, like talking about it, but like I didn't want to obey it. So I want to say with like not wanting to obey it, like it was still like it was a struggle. Like I still kind of struggle with that. Like, should I do this? And I think what like made me upset that I was not wanting to obey it is because this was not the kind of person I wanted to be, to like ignore my convictions for a boy, and a very pretty boy at that. And so yeah, that was the thing that I did not want to give this up. So going into high school, I remember like the first little bit of high school feeling distant from God. And like I remember we had like Bible class in the first semester, and the teacher was talking a lot about like hearing God and like God speaking to you and stuff like that. And I remember the time being like, of course, with like my experience of like crying out to God, like I knew God would speak to me, but I didn't want that, because I figured like, oh, what if he says this, and then what excuse do I have to not obey in that case? So during this time, and like I've thought more of like how to define like what I was in the wrong for, like for this. Like at times in the past I've referred to it as idolatry, which I think about that and I'm like, well, I don't really know about that, because I will say this. I do think that the accusation of idolatry, I feel like it's overused in the Christian community. I think especially when it comes to relationships, like when a girl like really wants to get married, people say like, oh, maybe she's making marriage an idol and like all that. And I think we've boiled it down to like, if we really like something or if you really want something, then that thing is an idol, which I don't know if that's really the case. I'm hoping to like study more recently soon like what idolatry really is, because I feel like it's overused, but like I could be wrong about that. So yeah, and of course like now I did still, I probably should mention this, I did still in a way, I did still keep my vow of like not dating, like because I didn't, especially during this first year of high school, I didn't even try to date him and like all that. So I want to talk about more about like some of the good things that came out of this high school time, because like I feel like I've kind of debated whether to share more of this, because I know like in the past when I've talked about high school, I've just kind of like brushed it all over with like, oh, I wasn't doing well in this time, but there were some good things that happened in my faith during this time, so I do want to talk about that. So the first thing to explain this next part, I have to explain something else that happened like during the summer between grade 8 and grade 9. I got into political media, specifically right-wing media. Like it really felt like with like 2018, it really felt like I did not start the year and end the year the same person. Like maybe around the to the people around me, it didn't seem like that, but that's how it felt. So see, I got into right-wing media, and I would say I still consider myself like right-wing, conservative, whatever. I think the main difference now is that a lot of the people, a lot of the pundits, the people I used to listen to and used to like, I don't really like anymore. I think the big and obvious one being Candace Owens. My goodness, has that woman gone off the rails. So, and there's that. Now, to be fair, I guess a lot of the people that I don't like anymore, like there are a few where it's like because of like scandals, but a lot of it is mainly just because like I find them annoying now or like something. So anyways, like all that to explain, because of getting into that stuff, is I found Allie Beth Stuckey, and I don't really listen to her podcast anymore, but like at the time, now it's interesting because it's like hard to say, like thinking back, it's like, why did I glom onto this person? Like I think, because I think I remember like the main thing that like drew me to her at the time was that she was conservative but also Christian. Like, I don't know, I guess I thought that was a rarity back then for some reason. So yeah, I started listening to her podcast, which was good because there was a podcast that was not quite right wing, more moderate that I was listening to before, but looking back, I was like, this ain't it, girl. So Allie Beth Stuckey was like better, and the thing about like her show, I think, especially in this early days, which I remember like I found out like recently was that like this was in 2018 that I found her. She had just started her podcast in 2018, so that was pretty cool with that. So it was in the early days of her show, and I listened to it, and one thing I noted was that she would talk about like politics and stuff, but she'd also talk about like theology and like more of that. So I thought some of that was interesting. And the big thing that was like really like kind of shook me was she put out the episode, I think it was her most popular episode for a while, which was like 3 lies young Christian women believe, something along those lines. And of course I listened to that. I remember, I think it was the first lie that she talked about that Christian women believe, and it's that you're enough. And she was saying that you're actually not enough. And that was kind of like, what? Like, because like it's growing up with like the self-esteem kind of thing, like that was like kind of, even like the whole VeggieTales thing of like God made you special, like that was it was kind of like, but from that episode I wasn't quite yet sold on the idea that we're not enough. But I remember one of the later episodes after this, she expounded more upon this you're not enough thing, and she said like, if we were enough, then Jesus didn't have to come and die for us. Which that was again like, oh, which like I didn't even consider that that's what being enough could mean like back in the day. And still I think like a lot of Christians, when they talk about like you're enough, I don't think they quite think through the implications of that. So yeah, there's that. And like this kind of this whole thing of like this, is she speaking out against like the self-love stuff. I was already like a little like, it wasn't completely new thing to me, because again, how I got into political media was watching PragerU videos, and I had seen one that Matt Walsh did about like self-esteem not being a good thing, which to be clear, I do not like Matt Walsh, but like that was already a thing of like, oh, like not everyone believes in this stuff. So yeah, back to that. Now I would like to reread like Allie's book and like learn more about this kind of stuff, because some of the things in more recent years I'm kind of like, oh, maybe I'm not so confident about this, or like maybe I think of my own actions, you know, like, does that line up with this? And I remember seeing something recently about like how like there's a whole debate, like it was a debate back in church history of like, are human beings inherently good, and like all that. And I saw one thing about like this idea that like we were made good, we are made perfect, it's the sin nature that makes us not good. And like all that, and like to say that we're inherently bad is Gnostic. And I was like, oh, when I first heard that, I was like, oh, I'm not so sure about that, but like that does make sense. So, and I will say like another thing, like during this time that like Allie's like solution for all this, she often says like self-love and self-loathing are like two sides of the same self-obsessed coin, which so like the solution to that then is to not be obsessed with ourselves. Now during this time in like early high school, like I don't know if I hadn't heard that, but like I didn't quite know how to like move towards like not being obsessed. So I guess I kind of lean more into like the self-loathing thing. It's like, oh, it's at least it's not the self-love thing. So because I didn't quite know what it looked like to like not be obsessed with yourself. And to be honest, I still don't really know. And I do think like I kind of like, even though like there may be some parts of this like anti self-love thing that could be looked at, I think as a church we would do better, instead of, especially in women's ministry, putting all this focus on like loving yourself and like all these things. I think we would do better if we put more focus on how to not be obsessed with ourselves. And another important episode that like led me to like change the way I was doing things, Ellie later came out with an episode called How to Read the Bible. And the one thing that changed how I read the Bible is she was talking about, she had mentioned something that like a pastor had said, that you should not open your Bible to a random place and assume that whatever you lay your eyes on is a sign from God. And that was what was said, but I kind of took that to mean, because like I'd been reading my Bible every night since like 7th grade, but how I would read it is I would like open my Bible to a random spot and then just read whatever was there. But I took that, even though that what was said wasn't directly talking about that, I took that to mean like, oh, like okay, I guess I shouldn't read the Bible like that anymore. And like I still think that like that was a right move, because like just opening up to random parts, like you're not even really getting the whole context of the book. So yeah, I think that was a good decision. So started around this time, like this would have been 2019. I took my Bible, my little Bible that my parents gave me, and I started in Genesis. And since then, every night I've been making more progress towards the end of the book. So it's been like 7 years now. And right now I'm currently in the book of Luke, Luke 19. I'll probably, at the time of the day of this filming, I will have probably finished Luke 19 tonight. So it's good. And there were a few days in there where I would read like more like during the day than what I would read at night. So sometimes I wonder like where would I be if I hadn't done that those few days. So yeah. So another thing I really studied like during this time, like on my own time, was I really liked learning a lot about like the LGBT stuff, like what the Bible says, and I listened to a bunch of ex-LGBT testimonies and like all these things, and like learning the arguments and like all these things. But the one thing that would kind of like make me think of like what I knew I needed to give up was when people in this issue would quote the verse where Jesus says, "If anyone should come after me, he should deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Every time I would hear that, I'd be like, So yeah, that was like kind of like this, like even though like I didn't quite hear like God like this whole all these feelings about it, like it wouldn't leave me alone, I guess. And I guess what kind of also plays into that is that it was around this time in high school that for the first time I struggled with assurance of my salvation, thinking like, I guess especially that verse, and like thinking about like, oh, I think I do need to give this up, and like thinking that my salvation was in jeopardy. And there are many conversations I had with my parents being like, am I really saved? And like all these things. And like, again, what I want to get through this video, like your salvation is not dependent on what we do. I think there should be like a balance that we should have of like, yeah, yes, there are some sins that we need to deal with, but at the same time, that doesn't make us not saved by not dealing with them at this time. So like I remember thinking like later on when I had dealt with this, that I was thinking like, oh, maybe I had reason to be worried about my salvation back then, but now I'm kind of like, I don't think so. I think, well, yeah, I probably should have dealt with this, but like I was still saved. So there's this, and then like later on there was like a whole thing that started of my fear of death. Like, and I guess this wasn't a completely new thing, but it was thinking of, but it was like bad at this time, like fear of death. Like, I remember I was at this like conference kind of thing, and they were talking about a girl who had gone out to missions, and then when she came back, she had a brain aneurysm and died, and that really affected me and like all that, and like, yeah, I was like very worried about death, worried that I wouldn't make this right before I died, and like all these things. And like some people are not always as helpful with that. I'm not sure what would have helped that during that time. So there was that. And then another thing that happened, this is kind of more like mid to late, like high school, like more like later high school, was my mom had started this. Because of that, I started this Bible reading plan called the Bible Recap, which I'm sure you've heard of this. It's about reading the Bible in a year chronologically. And so I started that process of like, I mean, of course, I was still reading the Bible before bed, but like doing this plan and like listening to the podcast, like all these things. And I remember, like, yes, but by this point, somewhere in high school, I'd realized that when I was dealing with the middle school, like, yeah, that was not right. That was a sin. So, and I forgot to mention this earlier. Like, it wasn't just the Joseph passage that like caused this fantasies, but that I used in this fantasies. There were like other passages of the Bible, like Proverbs 7, and like this is that. So, but I remember specifically like with the Joseph passage when I knew it was coming up in the reading, I was like, oh, how am I gonna read this without like being reminded or like doing something with that? But I feel like reading it, like especially this first time, it was kind of more like, I don't know, it wasn't as bad. I was like more fine with it. It didn't cause like as much things. So like, so yeah, like reading through the Bible, like that was like, yeah, it was a good thing during this time. And of course, during this time, like especially like mid to late high school, was when COVID happened. And like that was like, at first it was fine, but then later on in COVID, I was starting to think like, oh, this is not going in a good way. And I remember thinking like later on COVID, like, is this the end times? Like, will this ever end? Will we just, like, I remember writing in my diary this time, like, I don't know if things are going to get better, but are things supposed to get better, like before Jesus comes back? And like, to be clear, I did not think that the vaccine was the mark of the beast or anything, but like I was still like, from what I'd heard about that, I was still like worried about like what was going on. And I remember thinking a lot of times, the world is going to hell in a handbasket and I can't do anything to stop it, but I want to do something to stop it, and like all that. Which, yeah, I'd kind of wished I'd learned to more like trust God during that time, but yeah, you can't do much about that now. So yeah, and then, but like around the end of COVID, so when I was in grade 12, like I was approaching 18, and I like I guess kind of thought that when I would turn 18, all of a sudden I'd be getting dates, but that didn't happen. But prime throughout grade 12, like before I turned 18, after the time, I had kind of like, it started changing how I dress, and like trying to like, I guess, draw more attention to myself. And like, I don't know if I act desperate, but I had like more of a desperate mindset because I was like really wanting a relationship. And I am thankful I didn't get into one at the time, because with like the mindset I was in, I might have accepted things that were not as great. So yeah, like, Yeah. So I don't, somewhere in my 12th grade year, that was like a whole thing, but I signed up and I was going to be going to Bible college after high school. So I was, so like, yeah, that was happening after high school. And then during that summer between like last year of high school and starting Bible college, stuff happened at the dance studio, which meant, I don't want to get into too much details, but essentially I lost that community. And like, it's not like I was particularly close with anyone there, but that was still like a shock. And I wanted to talk to my high school friends about it, but they're all busy and stuff. So like going into Bible college where I knew a few people, but I didn't know many people, I was just desperate for community, like all these things. So I showed up like the first day, like in like the weekend where people were getting to know each other before school starts, and I connected pretty well with the people there. It was really fun, like connecting with all these people. So yeah, and I thought like the weekend I was like, okay, well this is all fun, but what about when school starts and like all these things? But surprising to my surprise, when school starts, I like still loved it. Like I was still like learning things and like still like connecting with people and like all these things. And like yeah, for like at least the first month I like really enjoyed it there. And then there came a hard patch where I felt I was liking like one of the guys like there. And then it was like, but then I felt like, okay, I guess it's time that I really deal with this crush stuff. And so I did. It was not an overnight thing, but I still dealt with it, or so I thought. So yeah, I was dealing with all that and feeling more peace and like being on a better path. But then things started to get a little rocky again, and I wasn't sleeping as well. Next thing I know, I end up hospitalized for a mental health episode. That was a tough time, a really scary time. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was tough. Yeah, and I felt that when I came back to school, like after all that, I like felt very stagnant in my faith. I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. But I think looking back, the main thing about it was that I wasn't like feeling like the good feelings that I was feeling earlier after I'd first dealt with it. And I wasn't sure why, because I didn't think there was anything I was holding back or anything. So I was like, what's going on? Why am I not feeling anything? But I also felt like around this time, like the second half of first year Bible college, but like I felt like hearing all these things. I felt like I want to get baptized. I think I should get baptized. I'd put off baptism for a while because I'd always heard that the devil comes after you harder or whatever after baptism, and I didn't want that. So, but I realized like, okay, well, but it's obedience to get baptized. So I thought to get baptized, and well, of course, I had still in the back of my mind knew the thing that like things are gonna get harder afterwards. I for some reason thought that baptism, like things would be better spiritually forward after this, but it was not. And this is in my second year of Bible college now that I got baptized, and after that, things did not go as well. My friendship with this one girl at the Bible college, things were starting to get more tense between us and all that, and I was like still like really wanting to get into a relationship, like because I was like the first few like a month or so of Bible college I was fine being single, but then eventually I wanted to be more in a relationship. So I was there's time where I was really, you know, I guess pursuing this guy, and I even in a way told him that I liked him the first time I did that, and it was also the first time I got rejected. I don't really blame him. I was kind of insane towards him. And of course, from the sounds of it, he already had his eye on the girl he would eventually marry, so I didn't really have a chance. But anyways, like I was insane. So like there's that, and like wrestling with like all these things, and like still and I was starting to resent God for like the hospitalization, because I felt like things have not been well spiritually during that time, or I guess what it really was, I wasn't feeling things were going well, so that was hard. And then towards, and then still in the second year later on, there was another kind of mental health episode. Thankfully, I didn't need to be hospitalized, this time, but it was kind of like it didn't show up as I expected. And earlier, or like like a month or so before this, I had seen a thing. I was putting together my TBR for what I'm doing now, and I saw the thing. I started to see like a first thing about like spicy books, but a specific author, spicy books, and like how that impacts. And I remember this girl was talking about that, and she was like saying like, "Oh, this isn't helping your fantasies problem," and I was like, "I don't have that problem." But then like during this time of not doing well, I was like, "Oh, I guess I do have that problem," although it wasn't as bad as it would later be when I talked about. So, but like during this time of this other episode, I felt like I was more closer to God again. Like I was more like wanting to read my Bible and like taking comfort from the Word and all that, and got close to this friend again where things weren't as tense because we were both dealing with stuff. So again, it's not a good way to end like the second year. It's like things are a little better than it started, but still not quite the best. So after second year of Bible college, shortly after that, I started this YouTube channel. So like there's that and all that thing, and then like a month or two after that, I had a falling out with this friend from Bible college. So there's that, and then also during this later, sometime after that, it got really bad with the sexualized thoughts thing, where I was like imagining sex and like all these things, and like I was early on in my channel, I would read. I wouldn't look much about into content about the book, so I would end up reading books with like spice. Although I would always skip the scenes, but later, so I thought like with like all these sexualized thoughts problem, those sexual thoughts problems, I would think like, what do I do to stop this? And I kind of realized looking back later that like some of the books like I was reading, like they weren't really helping with that. Like I've talked about before, the one book that I was reading called Sunlight Girl, like it had a scene at the end that I skipped, but there was also talk about sex like in the book that did not help me with those kinds of things. And I feel like I don't, thankfully now I'm at a place where I don't really struggle with these like sexual thoughts as much, except like they appear in dreams, but and sometimes there's like a little something like in the morning, but usually like throughout the rest of the day, I'm not really thinking about that. And like throughout the week, like when I don't have those dreams, I'm usually better about that. So there's that. And then at some point after this time, I got a boyfriend finally, which I think about this now. That's kind of interesting. I remember thinking like when this guy had asked me out, I remember thinking afterwards like, wait, why is God giving me what I want? So there was that, and then there was another period of time where like after we'd gone on the first date and all these things, these feelings I had had for him before this time had like just left once we got into a relationship. And like I remembered back to what Ellie would say like about all things. Like at first I thought I remembered her saying that like you should like be in love with like the person that you're with, but then later I remembered, which like was more damning against what I felt about the person I was with, is that you should not be convincing yourself that you like this person, which I was definitely doing that. Yeah, that was so. Yeah, I was feeling kind of the same sense like about like the crush earlier. I felt here like you need to get out of this relationship. This is not. And like thankfully it took longer than 4 years. Like it was 10 months that, and then I finally broke up. And it was like I was kind of more like motivated because I remember like being in the midst of it, like you're not even feeling anything. This is not even fun for you. Why are you still in this? And like all that. So like, and it was hard to like break up, but after that, I felt like I not regretted. I was kind of like, yes, yeah, I like my life now. And I think another thing that strangely kept me from doing it is I thought that shortly after breaking up that I had to get into another relationship, but when I realized, like, wait, I could just be single for a time, then it was better. And then, so I mentioned earlier that, like, I thought, like, in Bible college I had dealt with the crush stuff, but then I said, oh, so I thought there was, like, it wasn't all, like, just at this time, like, it started, like, even back, like, in a way, like, in Bible college, I'd had, it seemed like it didn't go away, but it, like, especially this time, and unfortunately, even while I was in a relationship, but of course, it continued, like, after I left, like, still, like, thoughts about the crush, and it made me wonder if I'd ever be free from it, and there were times where I'd be doing fine with it, but then a dream or something would come up, and it'd be like, I'm not doing well again. Thankfully, right now, as of filming this, I'm in a time where it's not really like I'm doing better, and hopefully this lasts for a time. So yeah, and then I'd also, like, during this time, I'd not gone to this Bible study for a time, and, like, I felt like that I should go back, and I remember resolved, like, okay, I'll go back, and I remember talking to my mom about it, being like, I feel like this is what God wants me to do, and I kind of feel like I've been putting it off too long. I remember, like, Mom said something to me, like, she was like, well, if God is a father, and you don't do what he wanted you to do, like, he might be frustrated, but he wouldn't love you any less. And that was, like, really thinking, I'm like, oh, like in a way, I did think that my salvation, I still think that my salvation was dependent on doing what I felt I needed to do. That was a time, like, oh, and I'm still struggling with how that works, of, like, how do we balance, like, again, assurance with salvation, but not being complacent with sin and stuff. So yeah, is that. So one thing that's been interesting, I guess, maybe, like, the way I'm doing it is the problem, but I've always felt like during this time that, in the times I've shared my testimony in the past, that there isn't really a good way to end it. Sometimes I feel like something is still going on. I think this was, like, a good place to end it for this time, but what I want to talk about now is kind of some things over in some things in the past few years that I've been learning more about and thinking through some things, and I know that, like, on these things I'm going to talk about, that I don't know everything. There's still a lot that I have to learn about these things, some things more than others. So yeah, I'll just get into that. First thing that I've been learning these past years, like, learning about, is, I guess, like, the undemonizing of things. I've learned that just because people say something is demonic doesn't mean it actually is. And the next part, I know people might get sticky about this, but even if someone is an ex-witch or an ex-Satanist or an ex-New Age or whatever, just because they say something is demonic doesn't mean it actually is. They do not have some special secret knowledge that you need in order to live a godly life. The word is sufficient, and if what they're saying does not have a basis in the word, you do not need it. What I've realized over the past few years is that legalism is still alive and well in the church. It's just that I feel like it often nowadays comes in a package that is hard for people to recognize as legalism. The next thing that I've been learning about, I think, more recently, is about the deliverance ministry. A born-again believer cannot have indwelling demons, and the Bible doesn't tell us to seek out deliverance ministers and, like, all these things, and we never see in scripture a demon being cast out of a born-again believer. And yeah, there's more I could say on that. There's more I have said on that, but I think that is enough for now. Forgiveness. This is something that it seems like even Christians who I would consider more, like, biblically solid or whatever, this is something that even a lot of them get wrong, and that is that biblical forgiveness is about reconciliation. And I feel like even a lot of Christians nowadays take the more, like, therapeutic approach to forgiveness, which is that forgiveness is all on you and it's just about you, and, like, how it is they had like the person who wronged you like can be involved, but doesn't have to be, and like all that. But if true biblical forgiveness is about reconciliation, then you can't forgive someone who hasn't repented of what they did to you. The forgiveness model is laid out in Matthew 18. Hold on. Yes, it is Matthew 18. That is the process of forgiveness, not something that you have to do on your own. Now, to be clear, like I sort of wonder if like maybe Christians might still be practicing it right but not using the right language. That just because you can't forgive someone who hasn't repented, that does not mean that you get to hold on to bitterness towards that person. While we may not be able to forgive the person who hasn't repented, I think the biblical way is that we must always have our hearts be, well, we must prepare our hearts to be ready to forgive the person if they do repent. So, and I think in like having your heart be ready to forgive, I think you will experience the freedom that people think comes from forgiving the person who wronged you who hasn't repented. And what's interesting, I kind of want to tie it back to like the falling out with my friend, because I think this was the point where I kind of realized like, wait, maybe I don't understand forgiveness as well. So we had the falling out, and I was trying at the time to like gather together like what I had realized and what I gathered it and bring to her like, hey, you like hurt me by like doing this, but she didn't want to have like the phone call about that. And like, but we would still like text like sometimes, like saying some things, and like this time I said things I shouldn't have. And I remember in one of our exchanges she said like, well, you clearly haven't forgiven me. And then I remember kind of thinking in that moment, like wondering like, wait, maybe I don't have forgiveness all understood, because I thought like, wait, does forgiveness mean I have to stay in relationship with the person who hurt me? Does forgiveness mean that I can't set boundaries? Does forgiveness mean I have to pretend that what this person did was actually okay? Like all that. And what's interesting, what I realized later with like going back to Matthew 18 was that though I didn't realize yet I was trying to start the process of forgiveness with her by like doing Matthew 18 and going to her and saying like what was wrong, and she wouldn't do that. So like I was trying to start the process of forgiveness, and that wasn't working. And I think like with forgiveness, like when the person hasn't repented, like it puts so much on the person who was hurt. And like I guess in a way to forgive when the person hasn't repented, you do kind of have to pretend that what they did was okay. And then this is kind of more like another story of something interesting that happened, and I said this is like a burden for these kinds of people, but it feels like it's kind of faded over time, but I hope I still do well with this. So, in talking about like the LGBT stuff again, there was a point in my life where I really felt like learning more about like the burden for like trans people and like what's going on with that. So there was a time like in the past few years where I was kind of like not really wanting to get into the political stuff and trying to put my days of like arguing in comment sections about the stuff behind me, kind of being like, yeah, well, I just want to get along, I don't want to cause any problems, like all these things. And what kind of challenged that was a post I saw from someone I knew who I guess now considers themselves trans, and they were saying like, oh, people say I hate myself because I'm this way, and then I don't hate myself, and like all these things. And I remember like kind of wanting me to like engage with this again. Of course I didn't say anything to this person, but I kind of thought, but you're still disregarding the body that God gave you by like living this way. So yeah, there was that. And then when I went back to the Bible study, this person like brought up this theory that like the trans people are just autistic people, that in a way, like it's just neurotypicals not knowing what to do with these autistic people who don't fit in and don't commit to the perfect, like perfectly masculine or perfectly feminine like kind of way, and so they take advantage of that. And I'm not really sure about that now, but it seems like, I mean, I know a good amount of trans people are autistic, so I think there could be something to that. But like, yeah, that's something to think about. And then what happened was, like, I had a dream that I was talking to not someone I know who has this identity, but someone who I've seen at dance competitions and stuff. And I was like talking to them about like all these things, and like I guess like in a way like trying to be loving but also like get across like the truth. And like I was saying, like specifically this is like, it seems a male to female trans person, and I was like saying like, you know, like you could still be a boy and like dance, you could still be a boy and like fashion, you could still be a boy and prefer the company of girls, and like all these things that like just whatever what it was. And I was like saying like all these things, and then I remember like it was like in like this split second between like in the dream and like awake, I had like heard, it's hard to show people the light when all you do is run from their darkness. And I remember like waking up hearing that and like thinking, I've messed up in this area. Like thinking back of like how I've talked about certain people behind closed doors, or how I may have like reacted to like people near me and stuff, and like wanting to be better in that. And then another thing that I saw was, I saw a post come up in my feed from this person. I think it's like a husband wife duo, but I think it's mainly the wife who's like who like has done this ministry for like ex LGBT. And I think it seems like what the story is that the wife like was identifying as a man, and but then now has gone back to being a woman. And I guess she might have gone with her now husband while she was still identifying as a man. But like she was sharing this post because she was talking about the fact that I guess Christians like misunderstood what they were seeing and thought that she was a man who had transitioned to a woman. And she'd shown like the comments that the people left, people, supposed Christians, saying these really mean things like towards these people. And like I guess like speaking truth, though really not truth, because they misunderstood what was saying, and some things were just straight up not true. Like I remember one person left his comments being like, God would accept Satan before he would accept this, which I was kind of, I thought of that and I was like, I don't think so. I don't think there's any hope for Satan. So yeah, that was like, I mean, whatever way, I mean, I still think there's like a way, like I think people should embrace like who they are biologically, and I think there's a freedom in embracing who you are by embracing your biological sex. Because if you base your sex, your gender on your biology alone, then you don't have to conform to any sort of stereotypes to be a certain way, because you know that no matter which way you are personality wise or interests or whatever, you are still who you are biologically. And I think that I don't know, I don't interact with these people as much, but I know that the people who are genuinely struggling with this, like, it must be like a lot of turmoil to think that you were born in the wrong body, or like, yeah, that's got to be a lot of turmoil. So I think we do need to have like lots of compassion, and like, yeah. So I wanted to end this video. Thank you so much for watching, but I wanted to end this video by sharing the gospel. Like I've talked about my story, I want to talk about how you can be saved. So God made the world and everything in it, and he made us to be in relationship with him, but we disobeyed what God had set out. And because of that, sin entered the world, and we now do things that are wrong, like all these things like murder, lying, cheating, stealing, and like all these things we do. And the punishment for sin is death. That is the punishment for sin. As a result of sin, we deserve death in hell. But God didn't want that fate for us, so he started this plan. He started with Abraham and like the family, and through that family, later descendants, he sent his only son, Jesus, to come to earth as a human. He lived the perfect life that none of us could ever lived, perfectly sinless, and like all these things. And then Jesus died on the cross, died the death that we deserved, and he rose again. He died so that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So I implore you now that if you have not accepted Jesus as your Savior, if you have not come to him and admit that you're a sinner and like trust in him to save you, I encourage you to do that today and to make a commitment, like all these things. Pray that you would come to know him.